The debate which is about to begin comes at a very key moment in our national political life. For many months, we have seen the candidates moving across the national stage, presenting themselves and their political goals. Those who are here tonight are the survivors of the long, difficult campaign trail. They are seeking to broaden their political consensus and to build a coalition which will eventually win one of them the nomination as Democratic candidate for the President of the United States. This debate may determine the result of Tuesday's primary election in Chicago and the rest of Illinois. It may even chart the future of America and the rest of the world. So listen carefully to what they have to say, make up your own mind, and on Tuesday, March 20th, please turn out to vote. Tonight's debate is being sponsored by the Chicago Bar Association. President Thomas Haywood will introduce the candidates and the panelists. Tom?
With us tonight are Mr. Mondale, Senator Hart, and Reverend Jackson. They will be questioned by Mike Flannery of WBBM TV, Carol Marine of WMAQ TV, Michael Cheers of Jet Magazine, Walter Jacobson of WBBM TV, and Ron Majors of WMAQ TV. The order of the panelists' rotation, the candidates' seating, and the closing statements were determined by lottery. The format of the debate is as follows. After a panelist directs a question and a follow-up to a candidate, the other two candidates will be permitted to rebut by a statement or a question directed to the initial candidate. At the end of the program, each candidate will be allowed a 90-second closing statement. And so to begin the questions, Ron Majors.
Mr. Mondale, one of the issues in this campaign has been the number of your endorsements and your linkage to what are described as special interest groups. You were endorsed by the Cook County Regular Democratic Organization headed by Party Chairman Ed Berdoliak. You have not seemed to stand as visibly and proudly with Mr. Berdoliak in that group as you have with teachers, with other labor leaders, other people who have endorsed you. In hindsight, has it been a political mistake for you to become involved in local Chicago politics during a presidential race?
Well, first of all, my appeal to Chicago is to all the voters of this community. I am asking for everyone to support me for the only reason that counts: who will make the best president of the United States. I'm glad to have anybody's support, including Mr. Berdoliak's, but I have not gotten involved in some of the divisions which are sad in this community. I love Chicago. I've had a lot to do with this community over the years. There's no city on earth that has more potential than Chicago, but it has to get itself together again, and I'm one of those who's trying to appeal to everyone in this community to elect me President of the United States. I'm not running for alderman in this city. I'm running for President of the United States and asking for the support of all the citizens of this good state.
Have you consciously avoided public forums with Mr. Berdoliak or appearances with him?
No, I've gone to every conceivable kind of meeting in Chicago, so much so I think Harold Washington wants me to start paying taxes because I want everyone's support. I want everyone's support.
Mr. Hart, has it been a political mistake for Mr. Mondale to have that endorsement from Mr. Berdoliak in the regular arm of the party?
Well, I think it is somewhat symbolic of the differences in our candidacies. Vice President Mondale set out very early, I think, to co-opt endorsements and to receive those endorsements of organizations, individuals, and political establishments. One of the arguments I've made in this contest is that the next President of the United States cannot govern this country in a period of dramatic change if that president is bound to old agendas and old arrangements. I obviously want, as Fritz does, the support of every element of this party. I don't think that's the question. I think the question is, what does one go through to get that support, and how bound is that candidate once in office to those arrangements and those ties?
But you've made an issue of this.
Let Mr. Jackson finish with a comment or a question.
I think what is fundamental is that now that Mr. Mondale has accepted Mr. Berdoliak's endorsement, the real point is that during a Democratic primary, when that was Mr. Washington running and Mrs. Byrne and Mr. Daley, Mr. Mondale came in the middle of a Democratic primary, and that became a divisive factor in the process, and that division has not yet stopped. However, that is behind us now, but that is a fact for the record. We must now heal our wounds, basically because if the party remains broken, we cannot win Cook County in 1984. And given the fact that there are 25,000 people in this sub-zero weather homeless tonight and 600,000 malnourished, we must rise above those divisions and face the greater agenda of a unified Democratic Party for November of '84.
I would say respectfully, Reverend, that that's rhetoric. The point is that there is a major dispute.
Walter, under the rules of the debate, it's now your turn to direct a question to one of the candidates.
I'd like to get off that subject.
Off that subject, and it's your turn to direct a question to either Senator Hart or Reverend Jackson.
All right. I don't know if we resolved that issue. Maybe we can get back to it later. Okay. Reverend, I'd be interested in your strategy at this point from here on out. I mean, based on the number of delegates committed to each of the candidates, you're way at the bottom of the heap. And your campaign, it is generally agreed, is detrimental to the campaign of Walter Mondale. Walter Mondale appears, according to the polls, to be the more popular of the two white candidates among black voters. Are you at any point now preparing to back off to the degree that you can allow the black electorate to choose between one of the two candidates who may eventually or appear more likely to be the winner? And would you take a vice presidential nomination?
You should not reduce my campaign to a race-oriented campaign.
Well, but I don't...
This is, in fact, the Rainbow Coalition. And the 3% vote I got in Iowa was not a black vote. The 6% vote I got in New Hampshire was not a black vote. They don't live there. The 8% vote in Vermont was not a black vote. And so to that extent, we can only get white votes there because basically only white people live there. But as we grow, the rainbow will expand. We intend to reach out for the locked out. We're making a decided effort to reach out for women, for Hispanics, for blacks, for Asians, for Arabs, for Jews, for those who've been locked out. That is in part the mission of our campaign. There are now 3 valid candidates running. I won a primary in South Carolina yesterday. We'll probably win the one in Mississippi by Monday when the count comes in.
The undecided one in South Carolina.
Well, indeed, undecided can't be nominated for president, so I won. Now,
Walter,
number 2, there are 3 men running. There are 3 men running, and I am at the apex of that triangle. And that's the very opposite of being taken for granted by traditional Democrats or written off by Republicans. Our posture has changed dramatically, but it's no longer patronage politics, or surrogate, or client. This is now peer politics, and that's the fundamental shift in the fortunes of the poor and the locked out.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Follow-up, Walter, to Reverend Jackson.
Between the two candidates, Mondale and Hart, Reverend, I mean, you have to talk practical politics along here somewhere. I mean, you're strategists, and the people who are strategizing their campaigns and people who work in the media are clear on some numbers and trends. I think you would have to concede that you would really be a dark horse if you won, in which case you are playing a very crucial role.
I'm a dark horse no matter how you... I mean, that's not the point. And I have no apologies about this horse. You know, it's not whether it's dark or light, it's a good horse, and it's a fast horse. In South Carolina, it was a winning horse, okay?
Thank you.
Now, I think the real point, Walter, is that beneath just this level of analysis, in our campaign, we did get more black votes than Mr. Mondale in Georgia and in Florida and Alabama and South Carolina and Mississippi and Arkansas. So that constituency is coming alive, but it's growing much broader than that. But more important than all of that, perhaps, we have won 10 congressional seats between last Tuesday and last Saturday. 10 congressional seats won by my campaign means that you now have a combination of black and progressive whites that can retire 10 boll weevils come 1984. We lost a nuclear freeze vote by 6, and you consider what that means to ERA, what it means to right to work laws and the poor. My campaign is expanding the party. 20% of the people who voted for me last Tuesday had never voted before. My campaign expands the options and the fortunes for the Democratic Party and for the democratic process.
Walter, would you please designate either Senator Hart or Mr. Mondale for a first rebuttal or a comment?
Senator Hart?
Well, I think that Reverend Jackson has as much right to run in this race as either Vice President Mondale or myself, and I don't say that for any cynical political purpose. I genuinely mean that. Reverend Jackson and I met a couple of times in 1983 about his candidacy, and as I'm sure he would tell you, I encouraged him to run because I think in the final analysis, the kind of campaign he is running will help whoever ends up being the nominee if it is not Reverend Jackson. And I mean that by broadening the scope of this party. Reverend Jackson and I see eye to eye on opening the doors of this party and welcoming all people in.
Mr. Mondale?
I think the key to winning this election is to select a nominee whose support goes across the board. And I think one of the things that I benefit from is throughout my public career and before, perhaps no one has been more intensely involved in the issues of justice, of civil rights, of opportunity, of mobility, upward for the excluded than I have. I don't say that to get my civil rights card punched. I say it because I really believe it, and to work for the needs of that average American who does not have a friend in that White House today. Across the board, nationally, I'm able to unite white and black and Hispanic across the board in a way that gives us the strength, I hope, to be nominated, but more importantly, to win against Mr. Reagan. Mr. Reagan is going to be a tough opponent. He's one of the most gifted baloney artists in modern history. And you have to have someone who's tough enough with the background and the breadth of trust and commitment that makes that possible. I believe I do.
Thank you, Mr. Mondale. Now to the third round of questions. Mr. Cheers?
Senator Hart, it has been said that you are almost invisible in the black community. Talking about the national black community, not just here in Cook County. How do you respond to that?
I have only, in some respects, been on the national scene for about 2.5 or 3 weeks. I campaigned for the presidency for a year, and I've been in the Senate for 10 years. And very little attention was paid to this candidacy until the New Hampshire primary, which was just less than 3 weeks ago. In every city I went into, I made a point of seeking out the black leadership, sitting down and meeting with it, talking about my record, which I think is as good as anyone in the United States Senate, on civil rights and equal rights for minority people. I have put forward proposals, as I have for this entire economy, that seek to open up economic opportunity in the future, particularly for those young blacks getting into our economy. If I have the chance, and I think I will as this race goes on, to lay those proposals out, to say that the issue in the 1980s is not whether Rosa Parks rides in the front or the back of the bus, but whether her son can own and operate the bus company, then I think I will get my share or more of the black votes, and I certainly know I'll get the black votes if I'm the candidate of this party.
Okay, Senator Hart, that's a good answer, but I would like to press you a little bit more, if I may, and ask you for what might some of these concrete programs be. In the April issue of Ebony, you answered the question on high unemployment, which, you know, in some cities in this country is 30 to 70%. What concrete new idea program would come from a Gary Hart administration to attack this chronic and acute problem?
Well, let me just give you 2 or 3. First of all, in terms of urban revitalization, Congressman Perrin Mitchell of Maryland and I introduced legislation a year or so ago that dramatically changed the nature of the so-called urban enterprise zone approach. As I discussed with Mayor Washington a few days ago, what this approach would do is to empower people, residents of a community, to become involved in the determination of how that zone, enterprise zone if you will, evolves, up to and including ownership of stock in companies that locate in that urban area. Second, I believe in minority enterprise. In my own state, when the energy boom of the 1970s was going on, I set up a task force with the leaders of the energy industry, with black and Hispanic business people, men and women in Colorado, to seek ways in which they could subcontract for any major development of energy supplies in my state. Third, I have been a strong proponent of a whole range of new education and training initiatives, including an individual training account for all workers, including blacks, and an American Defense Education Act that would increase national investment in education across the board, including urban schools.
Mr. Cheers, please designate either Mr. Mondale or Reverend Jackson to respond first.
Reverend Jackson, please.
I think the most fundamental question that Mr. Hart must answer and Mr. Mondale must answer, is not programs for the black and the poor, but a commitment to empower the black and the poor that they might develop programs for themselves. There's no lack of ideas by poor people. Right now, if Mr. Hart and Mr. Mondale would take leadership in ending second primaries across the South, we will in effect have 12 to 20 black, Hispanic, and female congresspersons by this coming November. And that would change the face of American politics. That is a very concrete need that we have now. It could very well render us 10 or 12 black congresspersons. I would like to hear him speak to that issue because that's very concrete. Doesn't require any new legislation, but it does require making a choice between the boll weevils and the cotton.
Mr. Mondale?
I believe this is a question where the past is prologue. We need a lot of programs for the future, and I favor entrepreneurship and a whole range of efforts that open up opportunity. But it's not enough to be just nominally right on these issues. I think we have to look at our records to see the level of intensity, of personal commitment, of energy and courage that we've shown on what has really been the central, toughest social issue of our time, civil rights and social justice and opportunity. I think measuring our records, there is a difference between the two of us. I'm not arguing about Gary's nominal record, but I do think there's a dramatic difference in the intensity, the personal commitment, the effort undertaken to move this process forward toward true opportunity for all of our Americans. And that's what you need in a president. These issues are not won easily. It takes courage, it takes guts, it's often controversial, it takes budgetary allocations, it takes a vision. For example, in this whole minority entrepreneurship thing, today, one of the reasons that minority unemployment is so much higher than others begins first with the appalling paucity of leadership, of ownership, of business. Government has to lead with licensing, with small business administration, with set-asides, so that black, Hispanic, women, and others can participate in the fullest sense of the word on the business entrepreneurial side. I think that's the missing link. There's a lot more that needs to be done.
Thank you.
But true leadership is needed there.
Mr. Chairman, but my point has been slid past,
I'll respond to it.
if you don't mind. I wish you
No, I would very strongly support Reverend Jackson's efforts, and he and I have discussed this, to open up the primary system in the South and prevent a situation in which black candidates have to jump two hurdles, one of which is almost impossible in many states. I would be very happy to do that, and I will do it as much as I can this year in the Senate. I can do it better in the White House. Let me just say one other thing. I'm not willing to let Vice President Mondale or anyone else in this country gauge my intensity of commitment to civil rights. I think it's as broad and deep as his, or for that matter, anyone else's. I can offer as evidence to that the support that I've had in my own two races in Colorado, not a heavily minority state, albeit, but without the black and brown support in the city of Denver and across the state of Colorado, I wouldn't be here today. And that support was not automatic. I had to earn it.
Thank you, Senator. If we could now proceed to Carol Marine, who will ask the next round of questions. And Carol, you may ask them of any of the three candidates.
Mr. Mondale, your staff has now been informed that at 10 o'clock tonight we'll report a story on NBC Chicago that your Illinois campaign has been infiltrated by a man who claims to be one of a dozen people whose job it is to collect anti-labor information, and he claims to have gotten access to your computer records. I'm interested in whether you believe there is any evidence to link this to the National Right to Work organization, which has publicly pledged to hire investigators specifically to discredit your campaign.
Well, some time ago, the Right to Work organization announced that they were going to have spies infiltrate my organization, and they may have done that, I don't know. If they've been able to find out as much about my organization as I have, I look forward to talking to them. I might learn something. But if I can be a little more serious about it, we have run a totally honest and ethical campaign. I know what the law requires, and we have lived fastidiously with the law. But I think there's another point here. I believe that organized labor is a legitimate and essential institution in American life. I believe that men and women have a right under the laws of this land to organize, bargain, and where the law permits, to strike. And I think it's an essential part of justice in our country. And one of the causes that I've fought for all my life is that kind of democratic opportunity in the labor management relations of this country. I don't apologize for that. I think it's a very important part of America, and I'm proud of the support that I'm getting from working men and women, especially contrasted with the appalling and insensitive hostility of the current administration toward those same rights.
Mr. Mondale, wouldn't I be naive to assume that an organization as sophisticated as yours has not pursued the possibility of anti-labor infiltration more seriously and more extensively than you would indicate?
Oh, we're about as loose as they come. Don't overestimate how well organized we are. Seriously, I am, every campaign, you have these cheap Segretti-type tricks that people with twisted minds resort to. I think the American people dismiss it for what it is. It is not what Americans want. We believe in fair play. If they want to do it, be my guest. We're running an honorable campaign. I understand the story tonight said they didn't find anything. There isn't anything. The reason they're doing it is they don't like my position on support of working people. Well, so be it.
Senator Hart, Reverend Jackson, you have the opportunity to respond, though this is not necessarily specific to your campaign. Senator?
Well, I, of course, know nothing about the story. I deplore it if, in fact, there is something to it, whether it involves Fritz's campaign or anyone's campaign. I think those kinds of tactics should have been done away with the departure of Mr. Nixon from the White House. I'd just say a word about that also. There is some suggestion that one candidate alone is for working people in this race. My commitment to the process of collective bargaining and the rights of working men and women is also, I think, as strong and as deep as Vice President Mondale's. That does not mean that I agree with everything that the labor organizations and AFL-CIO want, and I think that probably was the reason why the endorsement went in Vice President Mondale's direction.
Now, wait a minute.
But I think...
Reverend, wait a minute here.
No, before you guys start...
Mr. Mondale, Reverend Jackson has the floor.
You had your shot and told
I'd
jokes.
like another if I could.
You'll get another now. What's been reacted to, by and large, all of us have supported labor. I marched further than most people sitting on the stage. I've been jailed trying to open up labor, make labor be true to its own cause. So all of us support labor. It was not fair for the labor bosses to meet and give all the support to a candidate and lock 7 others off of the stage. If they had been democratic and fair, they would have passed out a ballot with all 8 names. They would have allowed the workers to make an expression. The workers were disenfranchised. And so Mr. Mondale got the endorsement, but the rank and file rebelled. That was not in the best interest of Mr. Mondale, or labor, or working people. I hope next time around that we will, in fact, begin to embrace the labor movement, but at a level where labor takes into account the fact that there are unorganized workers who need to be organized, and there are members within labor who need to be heard. The bossism from the top down is unwelcomed.
Mike Flannery?
Do I get a chance to respond to this one, Church?
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead. Like Mr. Mondale.
As you know, Senator, I have disagreed with labor. I am an independent person. I'm a person in my own right, but I'll tell you why working people in Illinois are supporting me. The other day when I went down to that Belvedere plant, there's 3,000 or 4,000 people that have jobs there because of the leadership that some of us provided in saving that Chrysler plant. Made a tremendous difference in their lives. I fought for that loan. You didn't. I've spent a lot of my life in the battles for decency, for opportunity, and for job for working Americans, and that's why I'm getting their support.
If we can now proceed to Mike Flannery.
Okay, I'm sure Gary Hart wants to answer that one, but
We'll come back
I'll
to it.
direct my question to Senator Hart. As you might imagine, over the past several days, each of us has gotten a lot of input on what questions we ought to ask here. The one thing that I've heard a lot about is people want to know where you guys stand on taxes, and they've told me all of those Democrats want to raise taxes, don't they? Well, in fact, each of you does have a proposal for increasing taxes to help balance the budget here. Explain why you think that's necessary, especially in light of the fact that public opinion surveys continually show that many Americans believe the federal government wastes vast sums of money and that it doesn't deserve a tax increase.
Well, first and foremost, in terms of my own philosophy on the matter, I strongly oppose the so-called Kemp-Roth supply-side economic approach dating back to the time when it first reared its ugly head in 78 or 79. I campaigned against it actively in Colorado in 1980 when I ran for re-election, and I said at that time, if that tax cut were enacted, it would lead to the most devastating record-high deficits in the history of this country and come back to hurt this country's economy and the people who ostensibly were going to be helped by that cut. So we have to restore the degree of progressivity which that tax cut devastated. It was not a progressive tax system when that tax cut went into effect. It's even flattened the rates out even more. I do propose a modest increase in taxes, particularly for those in the upper middle and upper income brackets, to restore progressivity. I also propose some massive overhauls of our income tax system to shelter those at the bottom against the ravages both of inflation and the unfair tax system we have. And I think we have to overhaul the corporate tax system as well, so that corporations only get tax breaks in the form of tax credits for direct investment back in their plants. The tax increases for middle-income people that I would support to help balance the budget range to no more than about $600 a year.
What about the other part of that? That continually people have a general impression out there that in Washington they are wasting billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars.
They are indeed, and who's doing it most is Ronald Reagan. One of the great political ironies of our time, perhaps any time, is the man who ran against the Carter deficits, which, as I recall, averaged about $40 billion a year, and probably won on that issue as much as anything, has quintupled those deficits in 3 years. I must say, with the help of too many Democrats in the process. This is the biggest spender in this country's history, and he's doing it in the biggest, most wasteful bureaucracy in Washington called the Department of Defense.
In other words, Mike, what's critical is that Reagan came into office campaigning on balanced budget. It went from $30 billion to $200 billion. Those who make the most pay the least, and those who make the least are paying the most. That's the absurdity of Reaganomics, as Congressman Savage once called it. It's a kind of reverse Robin Hood process, taken from the poor, given to the rich. On the other hand, once these corporations got the tax breaks, if they had then been obligated to reinvest in this economy, retrain this workforce and reindustrialize our workforce, then we could be assertive and move toward competition as opposed to reactionary and move toward content. Therefore, that was not a good leverage of that tax system. I submit to you that what must happen now is that these corporations who get our tax dollars must not be allowed to take our tax dollars and then take our jobs, closing plants on workers without notice, and go into slave labor markets abroad. If corporate America pays its share of taxes, the poor will have far less to pay.
Mr. Mondale?
There will be taxes after this next election, and if Mr. Reagan is reelected, he'll ask for them. What they've asked for is a study about taxes to report after the election. Now, why do you suppose they picked that fortuitous time? Because it's clear they're going to sock the same people after the election that got no help before the election. In the last Reagan tax cut, people making over $200,000 a year picked up $60,000 in tax relief over 3 years, while Americans making $30,000 a year or less, all taxes considered, either got a tax increase or no tax relief at all. In the background of our Secretary Reagan, they said, well, what are you studying? He said, we're studying a national sales tax, we're studying a value-added tax, and we're studying a flat tax. Well, that's all code for the same thing. It is that marginal, middle, low-income family of just working, making ends meet that are going to get socked by this administration. And that's why I see...
Who would get socked by a Mondale administration?
What I have gotten... Here are my proposals. Number one, I would put a 10% surtax on people making over $100,000. I would cap the 1983 tax cut at $60,000. I would put a 10% minimum tax on corporations. We have some 90,000 of them now that go tax-free. I would reform and defer indexing so that people making about $35,000 a year or less will be held harmless. And I would put a full court press on the enforcement of tax collections on the underground economy. And I would do some tightening up on tax loopholes. All of that would pick up over $60 billion, and it would be fair to that middle and moderate income family that really desperately needs help today. They're the ones that can't make ends meet, just barely getting through the month, can't save anything, and they're the ones that are going to get it from the Reagan administration, and they're entitled to have a president who stands up for them. They're paying enough.
Thank you, Mr. Mondale. Mr. Majors, your question should go to Reverend Jackson.
Reverend Jackson, recently during the Southern campaigns, you criticized some black leaders who did not give you full support, and you said they missed an opportunity in the South. Is that a fair criticism based on the fact that the mayor of Chicago has given you only a preference and not a full endorsement?
His support in Chicago has been sufficient for me. Blacks who run slow need crushing blocks. Those who run as swift as I do only need just deference. That's enough. I can get through the hole, you know. My point in the South was that we find ourselves 18 years after the Voting Rights Act. Blacks are about 12% of the population. We're about 1% of the elected officials. At this rate, it will take us 198 years to achieve parity. From Virginia around to Mississippi, where 53% of all blacks live, there's not one black congressperson later, 18 years. Why? Because the Voting Rights Act of '65 has been undercut by a combination of gerrymandering, annexation, at-large, and second primaries. If, in fact, those leaders had seen the wisdom in supporting this campaign, we could have broken the back of plantation politics in the South. They did not refuse to support me because of not appreciating the idea. They didn't believe how much potential this campaign has. Now it's growing every day. So my feelings toward them are not hostile, but they did miss a great opportunity to redirect the course of American politics.
So that we can understand politics a bit, could you tell us specifically how Mayor Washington explained to you he could only give you a preference and not a full endorsement?
Well, there are two considerations, it seems. One, he has, coming in as a mayor, ordinarily he would have been embraced by the Cook County chairman. He was rejected and rebuffed at some level, an attempt to humiliate him. So one mission he had, of course, was to solidify the Chicago base, to get a broad enough base of committed persons and congresspersons to support him, to give him Tuesday what ordinarily he would have gotten a year ago had it been as in Daley, Bolandic, and Byrne. I appreciate that because I support Mayor Washington. I was supporting him when Mr. Mondale was in his support in Daley. I've been supporting him a pretty good while. I continue to support him. Now we made another judgment. That is, he appreciated what I'm trying to do nationally. We simply worked out an arrangement where we share the delegate situation. He gave me enough of a nod to give me the support I need. If I'm satisfied and he's satisfied, where is the beef?
Mr. Majors? Ron, would you designate?
I understand that you're satisfied and he's satisfied. Now we can find out if Senator Hart is satisfied with that arrangement.
Well, being one of the least well-known candidates when this race began, I didn't anticipate getting a lot of high-powered or high-level endorsements. I have to say, not just because we're in this city and he is our host, but Mayor Washington has been as cordial and friendly to me as anyone in this country, and I've appreciated that. What his decisions are, I think, remain to be seen in the long run. I hope when we get to San Francisco, and it appears that I will be this party's nominee, that I'll have his support, and I believe I will.
Mr. Mondale?
First of all, the question of my support of Richard Daley has come up, and since it has, let me say I was proud to support him. I promised him I would. I came in and campaigned for him, and I have no regrets at all. I kept my word, which I think is very important. Long after I announced my support for Mr. Daley, Harold Washington decided he was going to run, which was his right. Harold's an old friend of mine. I called him and told him I would keep my commitment, that if he were nominated, if he wanted me, I would come in and campaign for him for mayor. He was nominated, asked for my support. I provided it. I think that my record on civil rights, my commitment toward opening up the process is as good as anybody's in America. I am very, very proud to enjoy the support of people like Coretta Scott King, Daddy King, Julian Bond, Mayor Coleman Young, Dick Arrington, a large number of the members of the Black Caucus of the House of Representatives, and across the board black leadership. I don't do that in competition with Reverend Jackson. I am gaining that support because of my record and my commitment, and because I've got a chance of defeating Mr. Reagan and having somebody in the White House who can make a difference for poor people, disadvantaged people, minority, working people generally.
Walter?
It may not be a mistake to parochialize this issue somewhat because we're here in Illinois and the election is Tuesday and that's what counts. There's a very crucial issue in this community between, as the Reverend Jackson just eluded Mayor Washington and the chairman of the Democratic Party, Ed Vrdolyak. Jackson has taken a position on it. Neither of you two guys seems to be willing publicly to take a position
On what?
on Vrdolyak versus Washington on how to govern this city and the party.
Of course not. I am running for president of the United States.
But there are-
I don't know. This is very important. We've got to elect somebody president. If a person ran for president and got involved in every dispute that every community had around the country, he couldn't get elected dog catcher. The fact of it is that the division in this town is very, very sad. It's holding back this wonderful community from its unlimited potential. What a candidate for president ought to do is to try to draw support from all the citizens of this city and from this state so that he can be elected in order to unite this country and hopefully to do what he can as president. I think the dumbest thing you can do is, it has nothing to do with arms control. It has nothing to do with putting people back to work. It has nothing to do with who's appointed the Supreme Court or any of the great issues that face our country. A candidate for president had better keep his eye on the ball of serving this nation, speaking to the great issues of this nation, and trying to unite people.
Do you have a follow-up of Mr. Mondale, Walter?
Could I respond?
Yeah, let Mr. Hart
Fine.
respond.
I couldn't agree with Vice President Mondale more in his analysis. The only problem is he did exactly the opposite. He did come in here a year or two ago. He did get involved in the contest along the lines that you've suggested, and he did get the endorsement of the city organization or machine as a result of it. I have been critical of that. I think that's the kind of connection that does prevent a president from reaching the kind of national interest solution to our problems that are imperative. I agree with Fritz. I don't think presidents ought to do that.
You've been critical of that and several other things in Walter Mondale, of course, because he's been the front runner, and then it seems to happen
No, that's
several
not the
days.
case.
All right.
I
Well,
wasn't
you have
critical of him because he was the front runner.
Walter, it seems to me what's the most basic about the reason why that's a mistake to have gotten involved in the primary. With a Mr. Washington with a very strong position and a Vrdolyak with a very strong one, the leader must be able to reconcile ultimately these factions. That's why I hope that the precedent of coming in the middle of a primary, a Democratic primary, will stop because it's not in the best interest of healing. I must appeal to you and to others here. While we bicker about that, I repeat again, our school system has been traumatized by strikes. Our teachers cannot get paid adequate wages. 25,000 folks in this town this night without a residence, 600,000 malnourished. We must make some judgment here about cutting this military budget and dropping this deficit so we can have monies used to rebuild America and put people back to work. And that's the number one crisis. Mayor Washington is mayor, and Mr. Vrdolyak is chairman for a day or two longer. But the jobs question is up on us now. And our mission, ultimately, once we leave Chicago and Illinois Wednesday morning, how to put America back to work. An industrial policy that makes sense is our key to victory.
Mr. Chairs, if we could proceed, you may ask a question either of Senator Hart or Reverend Jackson.
Reverend Jackson, your lifetime record has been that of civil rights and in the civil rights arena. But many people have been and are continuing to question your competence on industrial and economic affairs and matters. I would like for you to respond to that.
First of all three of us sitting here are public servants. Mine has been outside the government, theirs has been inside the government. I was involved in legislation, helped to get the public accommodations bill passed. I helped set the climate on the outside. Others signed it on the inside. I helped to get the right to vote, the open housing legislation to show that I was right here in Chicago. I helped to get us out of the war in Vietnam. Helped to open up the Democratic Party process in Miami in '72 and to get to where we have it, in fact, this day. So mine is a career of public service. You must finally determine leadership by what it does. That was a strike here 4 years ago, a fireman's strike, and 22 people were killed in 22 days. I asked Mrs. Byrne to let me resolve the strike. She said I couldn't do it because everybody had failed. I asked her to give me the right to fail. In 48 hours, the firemen were back to work. And that's leadership. Lieutenant Robert Goodman was in Syria. Everybody said it was a bad thing for him to be there, but no one was willing to take the risk to go get him. I did. And that's leadership. When it's all said and done, we know leadership by one's willingness to mold opinion and make things happen, not just follow opinion polls. And so I have survived to this point because I've expressed that quality and people respond to leadership.
Follow up, Michael.
Could I respond, if I may?
Mr. Hart, Senator
Without
Hart.
responding to Reverend Jackson's qualifications in industrial or economic policy, there is another kind of leadership, and it has to do with ideas and issues. Vice President Mondale cleverly has picked up a slogan from a fast food chain and tried to suggest that there are no ideas or issues when he knows full well that there are, in the form of a book, in the form of strategy and position papers, quite detailed, quite elaborate. The fact of the matter is that other candidates or the press or whomever really isn't interested quite often in what industrial policies are, what those detailed ideas are. I went around this country for over a year preaching an industrial policy. I think it's one of the most progressive. Leadership is taking the risk of putting specific ideas out in the public arena, knowing full well that your opponent can take a shot at those. Conventional politics says, don't state your ideas, be general, vague, and rhetorical, because you give less ammunition to your opponent. The irony of this situation is I've given my opponents enormous ammunition, and they deny that it even exists.
Mr. Mondale?
Well, first of all, if you read your book, which has been read, you read the
I
whole...
noticed you didn't say
no,
you
No,
did.
no, I'm trying to stay on the high point here. The word...
Here's a copy for
Yeah,
you.
the word...
Here's the beef.
Yeah, and you can read this whole book, and the word civil rights isn't mentioned. There have been two ideas that I have found that Mr. Hart has proposed, and one is a $10 tax on oil, which will cost every resident, you don't tell me, every resident of Illinois $600 a family,
Oh, no.
and cost 500,000 jobs. Oh, yes,
No,
this
that's
been-
not-
no,
no,
that
that's
is
not the
true, and
case.
it's been studied because it makes everything produced by an American business or industry far more expensive than any others. Yesterday, or the day before in Detroit, he came up with a proposal to spend $2 to $3 trillion on infrastructure. That works out to $100 billion a year, and would add about $100 billion as such to the deficit. He said this could be funded by killing the B-1 or the MX. As Rostenkowski pointed out today, that wouldn't pay for 1 year's production. So the two key ideas that cost money are all, in my opinion, bad ideas. We need new ideas, but the real question is not new ideas versus old, it's good versus bad. Who can get arms control? Who can bring about a reduction in international tensions? Who has the experience and the background to make a difference? Who will stand up and fight for that average American? I suggest that in the race for new ideas, I win. With the experience, I've got the background to handle the toughest job on earth, and I believe the American people are beginning to see that. point.
Reverend Jackson?
Mr. Chair,
Reverend Jackson,
My
then
point
Senator
is
Hart.
twofold. On this industrial policy question, to give corporations a $750 billion tax break, which is so large it traumatized the economy, if attached to that break had been their obligation to reinvest in this economy and reindustrialize it as opposed to going to slave labor markets abroad, it would have been a good investment. If these corporations had gotten the tax break, if they located in a high unemployment zone, or if they located in rural America, or if they built a daycare center at a job where a mother would have to get neither workfare nor welfare but could keep her family and go to work, that would have been worth the tax break. There must be a commitment to industrial accountability for that to work. On the other hand, when we look at the military budget, paying $150 billion a year to defend Japan and Europe without demanding that they pay their share of that burden at this point while reducing those forces, we cannot move. There's too much money locked into industrial policy now without returns and a military budget to have any money left for any ideas, old or new.
Senator Hart?
If Vice President Mondale's staff had read beyond the index of this book to paragraph 3 of the first page, they would have read these words. But to prevail in the test of this country's character in this decade, we must maintain our commitments to equal rights and opportunities, to real progress and change in the standard of living and quality of life for our people. We must continue to demand justice, and we must offer promise and hope for our young people, our unemployed, our poor, our disadvantaged, our elderly. Now, on the issue of
Where's the
tax-
word civil rights?
Well,
That's what I brought up.
all right.
Do you have that in there? Could you
That's
point
the
out
issue. That's the
where's
issue.
civil rights? Is that
Let me
in there?
respond to the $10 a barrel tax on.
Consequential.
Okay.
Go on.
Exactly.
Well, but
Let me
what's
respond to-
not inconsequential is there seems to be anger developing between you two.
Walter,
How are you going to
Senator,
resolve that first?
That's why I'm at the apex of this triangle.
Senator
I have
Hart.
to set the record straight on the $10 a barrel tax. That was a proposal that the Carter-Mondale administration came around to support, and I had the courage, one of 13 senators, to support a tariff on imported oil, not the one that I had proposed, but frankly a worse one, because the one I proposed would have rebated every cent of revenues to the consumers in this country. The Carter-Mondale oil import fee in 1979 and 80 kept the revenues in the federal treasury, and it would have had the effect that Vice President Mondale says.
Senator Hart.
Very
I've got
short,
it.
and then Mr.
All right.
Mondale, then we'll proceed to Carol
The Citizens
Marie.
Energy Research Foundation has studied your plan. That's not my plan. It was not a plan we proposed. Yours is a $10 fee on oil that will raise the cost of oil and energy in this nation to $60 billion. That works out to $600 a family, and it will cost 500,000 jobs because American exports that are already not competitive will be so much more expensive than any others that it will be a massive assault upon the competitive structure of our country. This is a new idea, but it's a bad idea, and it should be rejected. The Carter proposal was for $4. It was carefully designed to hit just gasoline and not the cost of production. This is an entirely new proposal. It is Mr. Hart's. It is wrong. Here in Illinois, where this industrial base is teetering because of the Reaganomics, this would be the worst single possible thing for Illinois, and I oppose it.
The
Senator
next
Hart.
question is to Carol, directed to Senator Hart, please.
You complained to the Council on Foreign Relations the other day that the Reagan administration has lectured Israel publicly, reassured her privately. There's an insistent cry in some quarters demanding that the United States move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Should the United States do that or not?
Yes, it should, and I have said as president I would do that.
And your reason for doing so?
Because that has been the traditional position Israel has taken as to its own capital, and it seems to me not to make a great deal of sense to have our embassy outside the West Jerusalem area where Israel has maintained that its capital exists.
Reverend Jackson, would you agree with him?
I think it would be a mistake. At this point, if that embassy were to shift to Jerusalem, it would shift the balance of power. It would be certain to draw more fire upon the Israeli people at a time when we, in fact, need to move and be less provocative. There are three ways we can help Israel, it seems to me. One, to supply Israel with necessary defensive weaponry. Secondly, to communicate with Israel's enemies so as to neutralize them and stop them from being Israel's enemy. Thirdly, to use our influence and try to prevail upon the Israeli leadership not to make any provocative moves that would make a complicated situation more so. Even in Saudi Arabia now, our embassy is not in the capital. And at this point, in as much as Jerusalem is a holy city for three great religions, that move would show a tilt that would get a lot of people hurt.
Mr. Mondale?
I strongly favor the transfer of our embassy to Jerusalem. Israel is the only nation on earth, I believe, where our embassy is not in the capital of the nation with which we have diplomatic relations. I must confess being a little confused by Senator Hart's answer, because just a few months ago, in a letter to the Zionist organizations, he said he would only transfer it to Jerusalem after negotiations with the parties and with the countries in the vicinity. The idea that this country would let others tell us outside of the nation with which we're having relations where our embassy should be located, and to hold such a thing up for negotiations, which incidentally would never end, in my opinion, is a very bad idea, poorly thought through. I think what's needed is a strong U.S.-Israeli strategic cooperation which is steadfast, which is certain, and which is predictable in the Middle East. They're our best friend, they're our most reliable supporter, and the failure to have our embassy there every day says there's something uncertain about that relationship.
I think, Carol, the most fundamental question is, will that shift make Israeli citizens more secure? It will not. It will jeopardize their lives more. Our nation must move forward with a comprehensive Middle East plan. The genius of Camp David, which Mr. Mondale supports, is that it was able to get Israel's biggest enemy militarily to drop arms against Israel. One way to help Israel is supply Israel arms. The other way is to get Israel's enemies to drop their arms. Good leadership, given how delicate that matter is now, will try to prevail upon Israeli leadership to be co-partner with us in a transition that would have minimum violence and reaction.
Could I just make one point there? I think one of the great acts of courage by President Sadat, who was one of my heroes, was that he had the courage to go to Jerusalem as the president of Egypt and address the Knesset. If he can do that, surely the United States, after all these years, can locate its embassy in the capital of the nation with which we're having relations.
Thank you, Mr. Mondale. Mike Flannery.
If I could switch gears, Mr. Mondale, you referred to the teetering industry of the Midwest here, and there are certainly a number of factors involved in the relative decline of the industrial Midwest. But one of the biggest problems here in Illinois is the fact that the federal government takes so much tax money out of Illinois and puts so little spending money back in here. In contrast to places like California or Florida, where the federal government actually spends billions of dollars more in those states than it takes out in taxes, in Illinois we rank dead last, 50th out of 50. This federal government comes in here and takes $35 billion out. We only get $22 billion back. Specifically, what are you going to do to correct that imbalance, which has taken $12 billion out of this economy every year?
That's one of the toughest issues you can raise. I think several steps can be taken. First of all, you've got the Great Lakes, which ought to be equally sharing with everyone else in military, in defense, in shipping. It does not today, even though a lot of the production is here. It is shipped and handled elsewhere. That ought to be changed. When you cut back on education and health and higher education, as this administration does, that shows up immediately in Chicago. This is a great educational community, and those cuts distort those flows.
Do you have any specific promises, any specific programs you
Mike,
can make?
But I have to get to the main.
I'm going to have to interject, gentlemen. We are approaching the closing statements. We're going to have to go to the closing statements because of the time is running out on us. And Mr. Mondale, you're first for a 90-second close.
A few days ago, I toured the Belvedere and went through the Chrysler plant. And I had the privilege of driving out the millionth Omni car produced by Chrysler. It was a thrilling experience. And afterwards, one of the workers came up to me and he said, "Mr. Mondale, thank you for helping us save our jobs." He said, "It saved my life because I had worked here 19 years. And if Chrysler had gone down, so would I. My pension would be gone. I couldn't get another good job. I've got gray hair. I know better than that. The plans for my children would be destroyed. And now, thanks to the fact that we've saved this plant, life is great." He said, "Everyone here feels the same way about it." The Chrysler plan, which I helped get through the Congress, was a great success story because it was based on cooperation. Workers put up $1 billion in deferred wages. Iacocca worked for a year for $1. The American people gave them a loan. And now we've saved 600,000 jobs. Chrysler is profitable. They've paid back their loan. The American people have made millions and millions of dollars of profit, and we've got a healthier auto industry. That is leadership, and it's based on two things. One, really caring about people. I do. And secondly, pulling people together to work for the best of our country. I'll do that. Give me your help.
Thank you, Mr. Mondale. Reverend Jackson.
Even as I think about the Chrysler matter, I support the idea of sustaining Chrysler because our farmers, our vehicle producers need to be saved in our steel industry. The fact is, Chrysler has now closed 13 plants. They have now made a profit with no obligation to reinvest in those workers to open up other plants. So Mr. Iacocca has, in many ways, a big success story from the top down. The boat stuck at the bottom are still there. My concern is that there are 5 million people under Reagan are now in poverty, 5 million more people, 3 million children in poverty. 15% of our nation, by the end of this year, from 34 million up to 41 million people malnourished are in a state of poverty. We must focus on those boats stuck at the bottom. If, in fact, my campaign is successful, it will be because I represent new directions. Mr. Mondale and Mr. Hart are not willing to share the ticket with a woman. Opening up for women is the way of the future for our party and for our nation. They want to raise the military budget. You can't raise the budget and in fact rebuild America. We can cut the budget without cutting defense. They resist parity, 90% parity for the small farmer. We'll either have 90% parity or 100% charity. Feed the farmer and let the farmer feed the nation. Lastly, this commitment to social justice, a willingness to enforce the Voting Rights Act now and end
Thank you, sir.
second primaries now is a way to lift those votes at the bottom. Those of you in this
Thank
area
you,
know me,
Reverend.
I will work and I will produce. I need your support.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Senator Hart.
This primary in Illinois, indeed this nomination and election race, is a choice between the future and the past, between the special interests and the national interests, between old leadership and new leadership. Old leadership and the special interests look to bail out companies sometimes after they're on the verge of failure. That does not do the workers any particular favor, and it does their children no favor at all. What is needed is an anticipation of the onslaught of foreign competition and an industrial policy in the 1970s that put all of our factories back on their feet, not just a few. And there is another leadership issue having to do with an area we didn't touch on tonight. That's called foreign policy. One of the issues that's come up in this debate in Illinois is our attitude about Central America. The leadership of the past that failed to come out against the Vietnam War, against Lebanon, and now against our involvement in Central America is a leadership that says we have to keep troops in Central America, that poverty is not the issue, it's communism. I disagree with that. I disagree profoundly with Vice President Mondale's opinion. I think our forces ought to come out of Central America, and I think this country ought to focus upon the real human needs of the people not only in this country, but in the Third World, in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. If we do that, we will save hundreds of thousands of young American lives.
Thank you, Senator Hart. We would like to thank the candidates for being with us tonight, along with the reporters from WMAQ-TV, WBBM-TV, and JET Magazine. The Chicago Bar Association, along with WMAQ and WBBM, are pleased to have brought this informative program to you. Our best wishes to the candidates in Tuesday's primary. Thank you and good night.